My name is Robin Lewis, and this is a story about a coffee table. This coffee table, actually, and how I had to make it. Let me explain. These are oak bed heads from South Africa. The glue joints are starting to fail on a couple of them, and they're generally starting to show their age. I was asked to turn them into a coffee table, and as we started working out the design, I realized that I really didn't like the idea. It's called a split level coffee table, and there's a few versions of them going around. There's a couple of aspects that I just didn't like, but the main one was that the two levels weren't of any functional benefit. I think form over function is fine, but only when the form is something spectacular. But this is what the client wanted, so this is what the client would get. I started by getting all the parts back to bare wood and removing all of the dowels. This wood is old, and the varnish has had a long time to yellow it, so I was pretty surprised at how blonde it was underneath all of the layers. The design called for two of the panels to be glued up to make the main tabletop. These pieces were too wide to run through my thicknesser, so I decided instead to glue them together and then use a belt sander to cut through the varnish. I cleaned up the two edges on the jointer and then glued and clamped them together. The client wanted to keep the original radius of all the corners, so the size of the coffee table was planned around the size of this panel. Then I started on the sanding. I've skipped forward a couple steps since the belt sanding, and that's because it kind of didn't go to plan. I did the same thing that I seem to do every single time just before remembering that I'm not supposed to do it, and that's using the belt sander one-handed. So running it back and forth, and one of the edges dug into the workpiece and went down probably about 3 millimeters. So the only way to fix this was to do what I should have done in the first place, which was cut this into 3 sections so that it could fit through my thicknesser. I ran it through, glued it back together, and now it looks a million times better than it would have after using the belt sander anyway. I was in a bit of a rush to get back to where I was, which was a glued up panel ready for sanding, so I didn't film it, but for the purpose of this video, we're back where we left off after belt sanding. The last piece to take care of would be the top shelf of the table, and for this I used another panel. I could trim this one down just a little so it could fit through the thicknesser in one go, but I did need to cut a radius into 2 of the corners. With all the pieces milled down to their final thickness, I could start working on the joinery for the legs. I went with traditional mortise and tenons, and as always, started by cutting the mortises first. The majority of the waste was removed at the drill press, and then I used a router to clean up and square the inside edges. After all the mortises were cut into the legs, I could then cut the shoulders on the rails, again using a router. When the tenons were just about fitting, I fine-tuned them with some sandpaper. Before gluing the leg assembly together, I ran all the parts over a belt sander up to 240 grit, then rounded all the corners and finished with 600 grit. Then I could get all the parts glued up and into the clamps and let that dry overnight. At the same time while this was drying, I was working on the tabletops, doing the majority of the sanding and shaping. With all the parts sanded and the leg assembly together, I could do a dry fit, and suddenly I started doubting myself. I was actually starting to like this table. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the design just worked. I put a picture up on Instagram to see what other people thought, and it turns out I wasn't alone. The next step was to work out how I would support the overhanging top panel while still allowing both panels to move independently with seasonal changes. I used some small feet from the rail stock and screwed these into the top panel. I sunk these screws enough so I could plug the holes with dowels. Then I could dry fit the table and work out where I wanted the feet to sit on the main panel. I could drill a hole through the main panel, and this would be oversized with a washer to pull the two together. Drilling the holes oversized would allow the main panel and the feet to move around and shift with seasonal changes as the wood expanded and contracted. Yesterday I had the client over to discuss what type of finish they want to use on this coffee table, and there were three options. There's water-based polyurethane, oil-based polyurethane, and just straight oil. Now my preference would have been to go with the water-based polyurethane to keep that blonde, beige, lightish color of the wood coming through, because the oil-based finishes tend to yellow the wood. But they've decided to go with the oil finish, which is great because it's probably the easiest one to apply, but it means that I need to make sure that this entire coffee table is sanded to the next level to ensure that the oil looks good, because there's no film buildup that I'm going to be able to rely on here. I started at 120 grit sandpaper and worked all the way up to 600 grit. By that stage, the timber had a sheen to it already without any finish applied, so that was a good indicator to show I'd done enough. I applied 2 coats of oil over all the pieces. And that was it, the split level coffee table was done. I learned a couple of things during this build. First, you're not always going to be making the things that you like as a woodworker. I had so many cool ideas for this table, but I wasn't able to see them happen, and I had to be okay with that. And secondly, while you may think you know what the project is going to look like, it might surprise you when it's full scale. I was certain I wasn't going to like this, but in the end, I really like this table, and I would never have pushed myself to make it if I wasn't forced to by a client. I think that might just be the definition of getting out of your comfort zone. And that's why I had to make this table, to grow as a woodworker. Anyway, that's my story. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Robin Lewis, and I'll see you guys in the next video.